Hey there, and welcome back inside the labyrinth. Merry Christmas, blessed Yule, happy Kwanzaa, happy Hanukkah, happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday. I certainly am, and I am really excited to be bringing you this next episode. Now today I am coming at you from a slightly different location. It is from my vanity table or cosmetics table. Still kind of a work in progress. I am planning, next on my list here is to get one of those light up mirrors, the kind that you typically see in an old Hollywood film. It's one of those really big mirrors that have the light bulbs just all around framing the mirror. I am going to be getting one, and because I do want this general area to have just kind of like that old school Hollywood feel to it, just from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, just that whole just kind of really just old school golden age of Hollywood type of feel to it. Now, one thing that I did want to start doing in 2019 is very possibly video blogging or vlogging about some of my favorite beauty products that I try, because I do try a lot of them. Some of my recent favorites include Besame, of course, Eddie Funkhauser, and I love Jeffree Star. Those are my three favorites, my three go-tos. And for those of you that follow me, some of you probably know that I do have a beauty blog as well. And of course I have blogged about some of my favorite products, done product reviews, things of that nature. But I think it would also be fun to do maybe some videos and do it here at my cosmetics table, especially when it's all done and looking very old school Hollywood, or at least as close to old school Hollywood as I can get it. And speaking of old Hollywood, Besame, my absolute favorite makeup line. They do vintage inspired makeup, and their research is amazing because their makeup is all basically palettes of the color based off of color palettes of makeup that was very popular back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. They go up to 19s. They range from 1910s to 1970s, and their research is absolutely phenomenal. One thing that they have done is they have partnered with Disney, they've partnered with Marvel, they did an Agent Peggy Carter line, which I absolutely loved. They also did a 1937 Snow White line, I have most of the products from that, not all of them, but most of them. And recently they launched their 1953 Peter Pan collection, their Mermaid Lagoon collection, and of course, obviously, that particular line of makeup is based off of the Mermaid Lagoon scene in Peter Pan, and I do have one of their compacts. Isn't that gorgeous? Oh my goodness, it's a seashell, I love it. And this is their Golden Sand Bronzer. And look at that, isn't it beautiful? But I adore this. This is probably one of the best bronzers I've ever tried. And if you use it together with Eddie Funkhauser's Glow Drops, you get a really nice J-Lo glow. Another great company that I recently came across is the skincare company, and they make all of their products based off of formulas from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. They're called the Lovely Rose. I most recently was sent samples of a lot of their products. I've been trying them, and those are going to be one of my next product reviews on the beauty blog. And like I said, I am really looking forward to just kind of trying new things, not only with my history podcast and show, but also my beauty blog. I want to do a little bit more with that, because sometimes when I'm doing other things, that tends to kind of get pushed to the back burner, but I would like to do a lot more with that in 2019. Okay, so with that all said, on to episode 17. Now, in episode 17, we are going to be discussing one of my favorite subjects and one of my favorite things to do in the history world, and that is debunking historical myths, because oh my goodness, there are so many myths floating around out there that are being accepted as truth, and people, obviously, I guess I can kind of understand if they're not really thinking to look into it, especially if you're not, usually not one to really study history and want to dig a little bit more in depth. But there is, I think, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of my other fellow reenactors and living history interpreters, there are way too many historical myths out there, and a lot of us do work tirelessly to kind of just put those myths to rest. I don't know how successful we are, because there's an old saying, if you repeat a lie loud enough, long enough, and often enough, eventually it becomes accepted as truth. And even if somebody is presented with the actual facts right in front of them, such as actual historical documents or any other type of proof that might suggest otherwise, or might actually just flat out debunk that myth, people will be very, very hesitant to accept the actual truth. But I guess we can only try, right? Now, this really started to bother me. 3 other friends of mine from one of the museums that I have done some work with, we visited another historical site, another historical museum. I'm not going to say which one we visited, because I don't want to be starting drama or anything like that. But I really started to kind of realize that this was a problem, the passing around of historical myths. It was when we visited this particular site, and this woman who was a living history interpreter, and she was absolutely sweet, and I could tell that she meant well, but pretty much everything she said was completely wrong, and it basically was everything out of Mary Miley Theobald's book, Death by Petticoat, American History Myths Debunked. Now, the book Death by Petticoat I have mentioned on here at least a few times already. And really what it does, and like I said, I wouldn't say that it's a be-all, end-all, but what it does is it takes very common history myths, and it makes you think. It's a good introduction, I think, to not necessarily taking things at a face value and questioning what, maybe the things that you might have heard passed around throughout the years. And the author of the book, Mary Miley Theobald, she has done work for Colonial Williamsburg, as well as some other historical sites. She actually has a website, a blog called History Myths. I will leave that link in the description below as well. And like I said, I wouldn't say it's a be-all, end-all, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I agree 100% with her. And I don't think there's really anybody, for that matter, that you're going to really agree with 100% on. But I do appreciate what she does in really trying to get to the bottom of history myths and get all the junk that's floating around out there, like just obliterate that. And I guess we can only hope, just obliterate that and let the truths come in. Now, when the group from one of the museums that I do some work for, when we visited this particular historic site that, like I said, shall remain nameless, the docent there, like I said, she's absolutely sweet, and I could tell she meant well, but she was going on, one of the things that she was going on about was the actual death by petticoat myth. And the death by petticoat myth, it's basically saying that, what it states, it's that women's petticoats catching fire and having those women basically be burned from their petticoats catching on fire was one of the leading cause of death for women in the 18th century. That, however, was not the case. Not saying that it never happened, but but it being like the number one like killer for women in the 18th century, that is absolutely it's not true. And that's the very first myth in Mary Miley Theobald's book that she debunks. Now, one thing that I do want to add before I continue is that those of us that myth bust and do, and try our best to push aside, the history myths and things like that and try to let the truth come forth. A lot of the time we'll face at least one person in the comment section or one person in, from somewhere in the peanut gallery or something like that. At least one person commenting saying, well, that actually did happen to my great-great-great-grandmother's third cousin 5 times removed. She actually did die from her petticoat catching on fire while she was cooking or what have you. And here's the thing. When we say history myths, we're not always saying that, oh, this absolutely never happened. But what we are saying is that perhaps it didn't really happen in the epic proportion that it's often made out to, or maybe there's a kernel of truth in here that got embellished, or yeah, maybe this is true, however, we're not hearing the entire story. But this woman at this history site, she was going on once again about the death by petticoat myth, and the way she was also talking, you would think that people in the 18th century had no idea how fire even worked. That there was absolutely, you wouldn't have known what to do if your petticoat caught on fire, or your any article of clothing, caught on fire. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? People have been using, I'm just standing there thinking to myself, people have been using fire for centuries. I mean, for millennia, since the beginning of time. Fire was one of the very first elements that people used in the most primitive of societies. Fire was used as a form of execution. Fire, it's like, I was just like, come on, what, I don't know, that just really, really boggled my mind. I guess I could kind of understand repeating the myth, but going on to basically talk about and imply that people back in the 18th century had no idea that, yeah, you could really hurt yourself if your clothing were to, touch the fire pit and catch fire, that people would have had no idea what to do, or there was absolutely there was one thing she said was there was no such word as disease, and I was just like, yes there was. I mean, it people knew what disease was. I mean, maybe there was a different term, maybe they used a slightly different variation of the word, but people knew what disease was. I was just like, I was almost, like I said, this lady was so sweet and I could tell she meant well, but I was almost getting mad, as she continued to talk. And it's one of those things where you're just kind of you're having this inner struggle with, with whether you should be the well actually guy that just kind of interjects and actually basically calls it out and tells the actual truth. And I guess what really bothered me too about it was the fact that she was basically, and like I said, I don't think she meant any ill intent by it, but she was basically painting people of the 18th century out to just be these complete ignoramuses. And, yes, of course, we have advanced in things like medicine, technology, and things of that nature, but to say that people back then were just so ignorant that they did not know how fire worked, or even to imply that they did not know how fire worked, that there was absolutely nothing around for to treat burns, which there's been formulas and things around to treat burns since the time of Hippocrates. Now, like I said, of course, we've advanced, But to say that people were just so ignorant that they just would have been basically standing around picking their noses and like not knowing what to do in the event of, you know, somebody, you know, being injured and needing help. I don't know, like that just really, really bothers me because it is absolutely not true. One thing, and it does baffle me how people can actually be okay with such myths being spread and talked about. I mean, I can understand maybe your average person not caring, but people that are supposed to be into history and caring about history and, you know, caring about educating people and educating people on the truth, you know, are just like okay with some of these myths going around. I don't know. I mean, I've tried to understand where some of these people are coming from, especially those that when you do try to point out the actual truth and actual evidence of the truth, or at least the rest of the truth, they're very, very resistant to believing the truth, even if it's right there in front of them. Now today I am going to be discussing two myths that I hear very often, that I am asked about very often, and those are, one, did women really wear, in the 18th century, really wear such bone-crushing corsets that they were just to the point of being disfigured and needing the fainting couches and all that junk? And number two, what's up with the no hair washing that people did back then, or didn't do back then? Now, I chose these two because they are ones that I do have direct experience with, and therefore it's very easy for me to just debunk them right there on the spot. And for those of you wondering, this is the book Death by Petticoat, American History Myths Debunked. If you want to pick it up, check it out, see if any of the history myths out there are, you know, ones that maybe you currently think are true. And yeah, like it's a very fast, easy read, and it really, like I said, what it does is it gets the juices flowing for you to maybe start questioning things that, hey, you may have once thought were true. Okay, so on to discussing historical myth number one, those god-awful, bone-crushing, disfiguring stays and corsets. Now, female undergarments, such as, you know, just undergarments in general, have evolved and run their cycles throughout the ages, and depending on which culture you're talking about or which era you're talking about, they tended to vary. For instance, you can look at a Victorian corset, maybe mid 19th century corset, and compare that with a mid to late 18th century pair of stays, and you will see differences between the two. And when I was at Fort Henry Days this past September, and you know, my musical group, we were companions, we were there performing, and I got to sit in on a lecture given by Kara Gordon. She is an 18th century costumer, and a very, very good one at that. And she even interned at Colonial Williamsburg, so she really knows her stuff. And I also interviewed her for the blog, and I will leave a link to that interview also in the description. And one thing she says is that something that I have been saying for a long time when it comes to wearing stays, especially 18th century stays, is to get Scarlett O'Hara out of your mind, because a lot of people, when they think of corsets, stays, and things like that, they think of just that very, very tight lacing scene in Gone with the Wind. And, you know, Gone with the Wind, you know, say what you will about it, but one thing that that film did do is that even back in the 1930s when it came out, one thing that film did was it spearheaded that great misconception about corsets and how they were laced so tight to the point to where women couldn't breathe, and they were passing out everywhere because they couldn't breathe. And and I'm not saying that there wasn't some tight lacing going on, and that hey, perhaps maybe some women did feel faint from tight lacing, especially if they were doing some sort of very rigorous physical activity. But did it happen in that great of a proportion? No, it did not. And several people that I have met that have worked in historical costuming, worked in, reenactment clothing, and, that general area, people that research clothing will tell you the same thing, that it wasn't as common as people tend to think that it was. Now, with my own experience in wearing 18th century stays, as well as, a couple times I have worn 19th century corsets. I've also worn some Edwardian undergarments as well, but I've had most of my experience in 18th century stays. Now, in my experience, and as well as the experience of a few others that, that I've discussed this topic with, is when you get a new pair of stays, number one, you want to make sure that it's fitted to you. In other words, you might want to avoid buying a pair of stays over the internet unless you have sent, unless you know your measurements very well, and you have, you send it to the person over the internet, just over the internet. And even then it might still be kind of risky because, just because you might have like your measurements, like your basic measurements, that doesn't necessarily mean that, there could be somebody with out there with your same measurements, but they don't have the overall same body shape as you, if that makes any sense. But ideally you do want to, if you're going to have somebody else make a pair of stays for you, it is a better idea to basically to have them take your measurements in person, or if they already have a pair of ready-made stays, see about being able to try them on before you buy them, because a lot of the time when people are uncomfortable in their stays, it's usually because A, they are ill-fitted, or B, they haven't worn their stays enough for the stays to really start to mold to their body. Now, kind of like a new pair of shoes. A lot of the time when you get a new pair of shoes, that new pair of shoes might be uncomfortable at first. You might have to bend them a little, break them in, wear them around a little bit. I've even seen people, and I've done this myself too, when buying a new pair of pants, especially if you're buying like say skinny jeans or something like that, you have to, kind of wiggle around in them and like walk around in them, squat up and down, just do things to break in that pair of jeans. Well, it's kind of the same, stays are kind of the same principle. It's kind of, and basically, like I said, you want to make sure that first of all, your stays are going to match your body shape and match your measurements, and also make sure that you wear them enough to where they can mold to your body. Now, when I got my first pair of stays, yes, at first they were quite uncomfortable. My stays were already made. I bought them from somebody who, made them a while back. It didn't fit her anymore. So I went and tried them on. I was like, since she was willing to give them to me for a pretty decent price, and having stays made for you, it can be pretty pricey. So like I said, if you're going to buy them already made, at the very least go try them on, see if they are going to work with your overall body shape. And thankfully, these stays did work with my body shape. However, I did have to wear them a bit at first before I felt, okay, yeah, like these almost feel like, like I can move around in them and barely even notice that they're there. And I have done a lot of different activities in my stays, which includes singing, dancing, blacksmithing, spinning, working on the spinning wheel. I have, I've done children's games, ran around in them, and and I still have yet to even remotely need the mythical fainting couch. One thing that Kara Gordon did discuss in her lecture is, actually just how practical 18th century clothing was, especially if you were a working person. And women didn't always wear stays. In fact, there are actually, and I've even read of incidences like this too, is that there were actually women that, say, if it was a hot day and they were out washing clothes, they would sometimes be wearing nothing but their shifts and their petticoat, and that's all. I mean, which, makes sense, especially if it's a hot day and you're doing a laborious activity such as washing clothes. And yeah, back then, washing and laundry was definitely a much more laborious activity than it was today. I mean, it really doesn't seem all that far-fetched for, a woman to maybe forego her stays for, just even if it's just to perform a task like the laundry. Another thing that Kara mentioned about stays is about how they were actually meant to be more of a support for your back, especially if you were a working woman. And I know when I've worn my stays, I mean, even if I opt for a more tighter lacing because I'm wearing a fancier dress, honestly, the only thing that I really can't do is bend forward. And so therefore, if I have to pick something up, I'm forced to bend from my knees, which is kind of how you're supposed to pick things up anyway. So the only limited range of motion is bending forward, and I have had to get used to driving in a car while wearing stays, because obviously stays were made in a time when there weren't any automobiles, so, and therefore women didn't have to really think about, driving a car. So a lot of the clothing wasn't really made for that purpose. And I think a lot of reenactors, especially female reenactors, could probably attest to the fact that driving in a pair of stays is, there is an art form to it. And I have, after doing it for a few years now, I have kind of mastered that. But yeah, at first it was a little bit of a challenge. And another thing that she mentioned in her lecture, and even a few others that have been doing 18th century costuming and wearing attire for quite some time, is basically squashing the myth that women were just walking around in these just restrictive, tight clothing, while men were just kind of chilling in these, very comfortable, loose clothing. And that's actually not the case at all. In fact, stays were not just limited to women. There were actually stays for men. There were stays for children. There were even stays for babies, because one thing that stays did was encourage good posture and encourage proper walking. And if you had this, like a baby especially, you imagine living in an 18th century home where, there's a fire hearth, for instance. You really didn't want that baby to be crawling around on the floor for too long. You wanted that baby to be up and walking as soon as possible. So therefore, the stays that they made for toddlers and older infants encouraged that child, that small child, to walk instead of crawl. And like I said, there were actually stays for men, and even the way a lot of men's jackets were cut back then, if they were to even slouch, even in the slightest, the seams would dig into their arms. So that's another myth that often gets passed around, that men were practically lounging around in sweatpants, whereas women were kept tight and constricted, and that's also not entirely true, at least not in the 18th century. One other comment made by Kara in the interview that I conducted with her is also, when we're talking about women's clothing versus men's clothing, is about how she doesn't understand how men are able to wear breeches, and how she would take her petticoats any day, and quite frankly, I do agree with that. But I'll let you read the interview. She's very informative. She goes into a lot of detail, and yeah, definitely check it out in the link below. One other person who covered the whole were the corsets and stays really laced that tight is Mary Miley Theobald in Death by Petticoat, American History Myths Debunked. Now she covers more the Victorian era when it comes to this particular myth or half-truth or kernel of truth, whatever you want to call it. But but what she quotes is that not all Victorian era women wore corsets, and not all laced them so tightly that they felt short of breath. But those few who did might very well have felt breathless now and then, especially during physical activity such as dancing. Usually a brief resting spell would revive them, but on rare occasions some did faint, and some no doubt faked it for dramatic value. A daybed was a fashionable piece of furniture found in many Victorian parlors. It was not designed or reserved for fainting women. And that is where she covers the myth of the fainting couch. And this style of chaise has been around since ancient Egypt, Rome, as well as the Elizabethan era. So it wasn't yet. So to say that something like this was specifically designed for fainting women because their corsets were laced so tight, it's actually, there's really no evidence, at least as far as from what I have read about and just discussed with other people who are pretty knowledgeable on this subject. Another person who goes into the whole corset stays myth is Eliza of Silk and Sass. I'll leave a link to her blog in the description below as well. She's also very knowledgeable when it comes to historical clothing. She puts a ton of research into what she does, and she's also done a blog dispelling the whole tight corseting myth. And now, like I said, that's not to say that there wasn't some tight lacing going on. Personally, like I said, I've done tight lacing before myself. However, what people also have to keep in mind is that a lot of the time if a woman were to lace herself up really tightly, it was usually a woman of higher means who didn't have to or want to work. And she could, it didn't matter if her range of motion might have been a little bit more limited. Kind of like in the Victorian era, I had somebody ask me one time about the hooped skirts in the Victorian era. Did all women wear them? Well, no, of course not. A woman who was at home cooking, like cooking over a fire, over a hearth. I mean, wearing a big hoop skirt would have been impractical as well as dangerous. So, of course, that would have been reserved for a woman of, say, Scarlett O'Hara's status, things like that. And, obviously, women's clothing, as I said, it varied depending on the station of the woman, the class, what she did or didn't do for a living. So, and that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, is that when restrictive clothing was worn, it was typically worn by somebody who was more interested in being fashionable instead of practical. And yes, there were those people back then too. I always say, every era had its Kardashians, had its people who were just known for looking good and not a whole lot else. So, once again, this is something where you can't really overgeneralize, because almost everything with human history is a lot more complicated than, and it's not so black and white, this or that. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more intricate than a lot of people tend to think it is, or a lot more so than the way it's very often presented in the media. One thing that I will add about tight lacing though is that wait before doing it. Do your research first, and also make sure that your stays are molded to your body, that you've worn your stays enough so that you can comfortably wear them with your body shape, and that you have been wearing your stays for quite some time. I wouldn't recommend doing any tight lacing if you're brand new to wearing period clothing, or if you're just getting your first pair of stays and they need to still be broken into. So if you are going to tight lace, just make sure you've been wearing your stays for a while and they've had an opportunity to mold to your body, that your stays fit well. I mean, that should be a given from the very beginning, and that you just do your research on it. Maybe ask somebody who's more experienced in wearing period clothing than you are, and I wouldn't recommend it to a total newbie who just got their new pair of stays. Okay, so with that said, on to myth number 2, and that is, what is up with women never washing their hair, or only washing their hair once a month? I mean, wouldn't their hair get really, really gross? Now, this is a topic that has been covered by people that do study historical beauty rituals as well as cosmetics, and this is also one that I also have first-hand experience with as well. Now, I will say that I myself, I have not washed my hair, at least not in the modern conventional sense, in several years. In fact, I can't even recall the last time I bought like a regular shampoo or anything like that. Now, what I do is actually my own hair care routine. It's a combination of what they did in the 18th century and what they did in the 1920s. Now, I'm sure a lot of us have heard, even as recent as maybe our grandmothers or mothers or great-grandmothers, depending on how old you are, but I'd say as recent as even the mid-20th century, where women would set aside a specific day once a month or twice a month, once a week, whatever, and have that be their hair washing day. And I know today with the way we traditionally wash our hair now, that seems almost disgusting. And this is one of those myths where if you're looking at it just from a very basic level, yeah, I can kind of see how, that might, you might kind of look at that and be like, oh, like, yeah, that's, ew, how could they have done that? But when you start to really look into how, even how like your scalp works, and how, just the makeup of like the, just the oils in your hair, things like that, when you start to really study that, break that down, and then look at what they did do as far as their hair care goes, it really starts to make sense. Now, for instance, what I do is, the 18th century part of my hair care routine is dry shampoo. And I make my own dry shampoo, and I'll even, maybe on the beauty blog, I'll give you my little recipe, my formula of what I do. It's just a combination of some very simple ingredients with some essential oils, cedarwood essential oil being one, lavender being another, and I think I used maybe peppermint or something else in this particular one. But it's very, very simple ingredients. It's very easy to make, and it works. Like, it really does the trick. Now, what they would have done in the 18th century would have been something like this, a dry shampoo along with a pomade, and the pomade acted as a hair conditioner. So so therefore, while the dry shampoo was in there and the pomade was in there, your hair was actually getting clean, because the oils and things in the pomade would actually draw dirt out of your hair. Now, as far as the 1920s goes, the 1920s part of my hair care routine, what I do also is about once a month I do a hot oil treatment on my hair, and this is the sample that the lovely Rose sent me of their hot oil treatment, based on an actual hot oil treatment formula from the 1920s. And look, that is such a nice size sample. I can't wait to try it. I can't wait to review it on my blog. And that was another great thing about the samples that the lovely Rose sent me, was that they were all really nice sizes, so I can really get an opportunity to just really try them, spend some time with the products, see which ones worked for me, see which ones are my favorites, which ones I might want to keep using. And yeah, so I would use a hot oil, and I hopefully plan to use the lovely Rose very regularly in the future. And in the 1920s, after they would do the hot oil treatment, they would wash their hair with a shampoo bar. Now, I've also been using shampoo bars recently as well. I've used Lush's. I do like their Sea Kelp shampoo bar, but I have recently also I discovered Grandma Soap and stuff at a few 18th century market fair events, and I've been using their shampoo bar, which I absolutely love. I did do a review on it, which I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. And and the thing is, it's like when I stopped washing my hair in the conventional modern way, my hair actually, just the overall texture, how my hair grew, it improved drastically. Now, at first, yes, my hair did get a little gross. Probably the first month that I stopped washing it. I stopped at least washing it in the traditional modern sense. My hair was a little bit gross for maybe like the first month, almost a month. My hair is on the drier side, so it probably didn't get as bad as, say, somebody who has more oily hair. But thank God I'm a vintage girl, because I was wearing the Rosie the Riveter hair scarf do for quite a bit during that month. So thankfully I knew how to do stuff like that with my hair. But after about a month, I started to notice vast amounts of improvement in my hair. And like I said, my hair, it grows a lot faster now. I noticed it doesn't break the way it did back when I was washing it the way I guess you're traditionally in a modern sense supposed to. I noticed that it actually became thicker. I mean, if that's at all possible. Or at least it seems like it became thicker. The overall texture of my hair improved. And I actually have several friends that are hairstylists, and they will also attest to the fact that it's actually not a good idea to wash your hair with a regular shampoo every day. And that if you are going to use a regular shampoo, to actually at least skip a day or skip 2 days. And I actually do have one of my hairstylist friends, she'll actually go for maybe 2 weeks without even washing her hair. And her hair doesn't get gross. And she's also switched to a drier shampoo, and I actually have, know a few other hairstylist friends that they have switched to a dry shampoo, and, doing things pretty similar to this as well. So, and another blog to look up, another great blog post on 18th century hair care is two nerdy history girls. They also get a little bit more into the rumors of, women having rats and things like that in their hair, because, they didn't wash it and therefore it got really disgusting, when really the dry shampoo along with the pomade actually was working together to help keep their hair cleaned, as well as acting as a nice conditioner to keep the hair texture nice. Well, my friends, those are the 2 myths today that I discussed. Hope you enjoyed this episode. And between now and 12th night, I will be doing 3 Ghost of Christmas Past episodes, because you gotta put a little bit of haunted history into Inside the Labyrinth. I mean, that's always going to be at least, that's going to make up at least maybe a fourth of the episodes of Inside the Labyrinth I'm starting to see. So, just because it's so interesting, I absolutely love it. I am ordering myself a Robert the Doll, so we're going to be discussing Robert again, as well as, the actual true story of him. I did cover Robert on Halloween, but I'm ordering the book from the Robert the Doll website, and as well as a little miniature Robert the Doll. So yes, our special little guest will be here, and we'll be discussing the truth of his story, which I think that'll be very fascinating. And I will also be, in the new year, I'm really psyched to have a couple of really cool guests in the reenactment world that are going to be appearing on the show too. So just a lot of good things are happening, and I know I said that I was going to be also doing this as an audio podcast as well, but I'm really liking this video format, but I do still want to do something with audio. So I'm considering doing sort of maybe a little quote of the day show, where I might, for 5-10 minutes, discuss perhaps some little known random fact about history. Just something like that. Because like I said, I do still want to do something as an audio podcast, but that's going to be coming in 2019, and I will be laying out the blueprint for that a little bit more and bringing you more information on that as time comes closer for that to launch. And I have all kinds of really cool stuff in store, including a cool little announcement that I can't wait to share with you guys. So I hope you are having a wonderful holiday season. Stay tuned for a lot more to come, and I will see you in the next episode, when we will be not really sitting, I shouldn't say sitting down, it was more like we were standing up. It was at Fort Ligonier Days, but I will be discussing 18th century baking with my friend and fellow reenactor, Ed Tutino. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care, and as I say, always question everything.